Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to talk briefly about a period of time called redemption. This is the last stage of Reconstruction. This is where the Southern white Democrats retook the South from the Northern Republicans after the American Civil War. Then we're going to have kind of a mini little thing at the very end about kind of how we remember the Civil War and why we remember it the way we do. So first off, for this last section, this last third of Reconstruction, so you have presidential Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson, then you have congressional Reconstruction under Congress, and then you have the redemption where it's the southern states slowly taking that back from Congress. So this starts off with an election. So it's Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War general, going off against Horatio Seymour. And Grant, the Republican, will win in 1868 against Seymour. So you see it's pretty heavily in favor of Grant. 73% of the electoral vote, 53% of the popular vote, so a solid margin of victory. Kind of show you what this period of Reconstruction looks like for the South. We're going to run through the Texas Constitution, kind of what the parts it had. So they ratified the 14th Amendment. It gave blacks, so the free blacks in Texas, the right to vote, and nearly every other right as well. And it centralized the power in the governor's position. Because while the Republicans controlled the state government, the local governments still sometimes were in control of the Democrats, or controlled by the Democrats. Now, to enforce Republican rule, Texas creates the state police. So these aren't the Texas Rangers, kind of similar to it, but it's a tangent, a little bit separate from it. So you have the state police, kind of a predecessor to the state troopers today that we kind of see in Texas. So the state police were there to enforce the new Republican laws. Now, what's interesting about these is that a big portion of them were black. So this is going to get a lot of kickback from it. So 40%. So 2 out of every 5 state police officers were black. So think about this. 5 years earlier, 10, 15 years earlier, black people in Texas, all of them were pretty much slaves. Now, in the 1870s, 20 years after the Civil War, they are equipped with guns and badges, and they can tell white people what to do. So this is a very different world that white Southerners, Texan white Southerners, are not happy with. Then you have public education being pushed upon the South. Up to this point, only the North really had public education. Republicans said, we need to educate our people. So they tried to force this through. Problem was, that came with a lot of taxes. So you kind of see the tax jump. 1865, bill or the Mr. and Miss Sherrod bill was $30. In 1872, just 7 years later, not much more in property, but their bill had jumped a massive amount, $361. So this is a huge jump in taxes, and Texans are reeling under the tax burden. So at this point, this is a political cartoon of the time. African Americans after the Civil War got the right to vote, and they're happy about it. White Southerners are just begrudgingly accepting the situation. They're like, fine, we lost, it sucks, but we're going to do it. And they basically just give up. They stop participating. But things are going to slowly start to change during this process of redemption. They're going to quit giving up, and they're going to start taking action again. Now you have the Freedmen's Bureau, which acts as a negotiation between free blacks and white Southerners. And it works pretty well, but the Freedmen's Bureau is slowly coming to an end during this time period. So during the 1870s, the Freedmen's Bureau will lose support, and that's going to mean the primary agency there to help African Americans in the South is going to be gone. And that's going to be a huge blow to black civil rights. Then you have the worst of the worst. You have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. So the KKK rise up, and there's no real organization to speak of. They come up with names like the Knights of the Rising Sun, the Knights of the White Camellia, and all these different things. And they see themselves as these noble vigilantes, dealing out justice. But what they really were is domestic terrorists. They were there to scare black people into not voting. Because if black people stopped voting and poor Southern whites started voting, they could take the South back from the Republicans and make it Democrat again. So here's a picture of a Klansman from that time period. So it's not the traditional garb that we kind of think of the Klan today, but this is what they wore. And every little group was like a terrorist cell. They had their own little version of the KKK with their own little goals, own little agendas. And if that one got broken up, it had no connection to any other KKK cell. So it was this weirdly successful thing that lasts for a while. And their main goal is to intimidate African Americans and the white Republican supporters in the South. So you can kind of see this, the White League, these are the white Southerners starting to vote and participate in government again. The KKK acting as kind of the informal militant arm to kind of intimidate blacks, and African Americans, the former slaves, basically in a terrible situation. Under slavery, they were protected in general by their white masters because they wanted the slaves to be safe. But now that they were free, you have lynching starting to take off. You have terror starting to be inflicted upon African Americans. In some ways, it's a worse life than slavery was. You still had your freedom, and there is officially, technically, the 14th and 15th Amendment giving you citizenship and voting rights, but not always could they be enforced everywhere because first the black codes, and then eventually, like we'll talk about soon, is Jim Crow. Now, Grant does help get passed through Congress laws designating the Klan as domestic terrorists, and they do slowly break up these Klan cells, and a lot of their leaders get arrested. But by then, African Americans have learned a lesson, which is don't vote, or otherwise you're going to get attacked. Don't get elected to office, otherwise you're going to get attacked. So while they do kind of silence this first Klan, it's almost too late. Now, what's worse is Grant looks bad during this time period. There's a lot of corruption going on during Grant's term. There's a whole series of scandals. You have the whiskey ring, you have bribes for politicians, you have issues with railroads, all these kinds of things. And it makes Grant look terrible. Public opinion of Grant drops off dramatically. Now, Grant himself isn't involved in most of these things, but a lot of his supporters and cabinet members are, or that relatives are, somehow they're attached to him, and it makes him, as president, look like he's not paying attention to what's going on. So there's a whole slew of different things. And you kind of see different political cartoons at the time kind of weighing down on Grant. 1872 rolls around. Grant ekes out another victory, decent margin. And he's basically resting on the laurels of his Civil War record. But you start seeing the South is starting to vote again in different ways. So Texas is coming back. Georgia's slowly starting to come back. A lot of the other states aren't quite there yet, but redemption is slowly starting to take place. The Panic of 1873 hits. You have economic depression. And this is going to make spending the money on rebuilding the South, reconstructing the South, and protecting African Americans less viable. So Grant has a hard task ahead of him to try to finish rebuilding the South, if he can. The problem is Northerners have kind of lost interest in this. They fought the Civil War for 5 years. They had tensions for 10 years before that. Then after the Civil War, they've been reconstructing the South, trying to rebuild it for the last 15, almost 20 years now, spending time, money, soldiers, and they're just tired of it. They have fatigue. They don't want to rebuild the South. They don't want to protect African Americans. They don't want to deal with the South at all. And slowly, these ex-Confederate white Southerners are taking back their government. They use a variety of forms of intimidation, even after the Klan is virtually disbanded. They have voter intimidation. If a black man shows up to vote, They'll intimidate him. They'll have gun shows at the voting booths. They'll basically force him to vote for the person they want, all these kinds of things. They start passing new laws, things like grandfather clauses, which says if your grandfather could vote, you could vote. You have to pay a poll tax. You have all these new restrictions going in to restrict people from voting. The Texas state constitution gets rewritten once the Democrats take over again. So this is going to look very, very different. So this new Redeemer Constitution of Texas, the governorship is dramatically weakened because the governor had been powerful to the Republicans and had done a lot of stuff. They wanted to strip the power away from the governor. Legislature meets every other year. The Texas Congress can't make a lot of laws if it doesn't meet that often. They cannot spend any money that takes Texas into debt. So that means things like schools would not be funded anymore. Now, what's ironic about this is still the same constitution that we have in Texas today. We still haven't changed it. We've amended it like 600 times, but nonetheless, and you can kind of see slowly these different states, see the second date on all these places, are slowly being what they consider redeemed, and Republicans are losing control and the Democrats are retaking control of these states. So, significance of redemption. It ends Reconstruction in the South. The North has lost interest. The Southern states create this spend nothing, do nothing mantra, not willing to go into debt. So if it costs money to help their people, the Southern states just say, no, we're not going to do it. So if someone says, I have this idea for a plan that could really help the South, the state will say, well, how much does it cost? And if it's not pretty much free, they won't really do anything about it. And then you have Custer's Last Stand. So this is a fight between George Armstrong Custer and the Sioux Indians in South Dakota. Custer and his men get slaughtered. And this is kind of towards the tail end of Reconstruction. And many Americans are like, why are we using the U.S. Army to occupy the South when they could be out west fighting the Native Americans? If our men are getting slaughtered out there, why do we even care about the Southerners when we have a real enemy on our borders? The final blow to Reconstruction is the election of 1876. So you have the Democratic nominee, Samuel Tilden, going against the Republican guy, Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, it's a neck-and-neck election. It's about as close as you can get. And the problem is, the last three Republican states in the South turn in two sets of votes. One that Hayes wins and one that Tilden wins. So there was some shady stuff in these states trying to fudge it to make sure Hayes won. When Southerners and Democrats realize that the Republicans are basically cheating to win, they are furious. This leads to the Compromise of 1877. So the Southern Democrats agree to the following things as part of the compromise. They give Hayes the presidency. They accept the Republican amendments to the Constitution, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And they promise to refrain from partisan attacks against Republicans in the South. On the flip side, Northern Republicans agree to the following. To remove the last troops from the South, so no more Reconstruction troops. Include Hayes, or include a Southerner in Hayes' cabinet, and to give conservative power or conservative political control over patronage. So people who are going to get jobs as a result of Hayes getting elected, they're going to go to more conservative people rather than the radical Republicans. And this is the effective end of Reconstruction with this compromise. So the South is virtually abandoned. The African Americans in the South are left to their own devices to try to endure Jim Crow that's slowly growing by this time as best as they can. So you can see all the different things as the states slowly get redeemed and get readmitted back into the Union. So real quick, we're going to have a short little mini lecture on Civil War memory, kind of how and why we remember the war we did. So you have this guy named Jubal Early. He was a Civil War general, and he kind of defines what it means to remember the Civil War. He kind of wrote literally the rule book or the outline for how the United States will remember the Civil War. Now, what's odd about all of this is that the Civil War was lost by the South, by the Confederates. But they're going to be so good at rewriting the history that we remember it the way they wanted it remembered, versus the North writing the history. Usually the victor writes the history, but this time the ones that lost wrote it. And this is, Jubal Early is going to create what's called the Lost Cause mythology. They call it the Lost Cause, kind of like the Alamo, that they fought this valiant, righteous lost cause. Even though they knew they were going to lose, they fought it for moral and idealistic reasons. Not true, that's why it's mythology, but this is what they said. So here are the main points. Secession, not slavery, caused the Civil War. It was a states' rights issue, not a slavery issue. Blacks were faithful servants. This means African Americans, the slaves, wanted to be slaves and they were loyal to their masters. And we see this in movies like Gone with the Wind and various things that came out in the period afterwards, just showing how long this idea lasted. The South was defeated by resources, not militarily. Confederate States of America soldiers were heroic and saintly. So you see monuments being put up in their memory. They died a valiant, heroic cause. So you kind of see this in like D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, kind of glorifying the Ku Klux Klan as defenders of the South. Not true, but we'll talk more about this movie a little bit later. Robert E. Lee was the most saintly of all. So they kind of turn him into a George Washington-like figure. We'll talk more about that later as well. Southern women were loyal to the Confederate States of America. That's something we know is not true because they were writing letters to their men saying, get your ass home. We're dying and starving. They had riots in Richmond to steal bread. Women were not as loyal as they wanted to portray them. But this is the kind of mythology that goes along with this time period. Movies are made about it. Books are made about it, or written about it. So some Confederates fled to Mexico, rather leave the country than join a union without slavery. Some flee to Brazil with their slaves, trying to keep slavery alive for a few more years. John Wayne made a movie about it, about these guys that went to Mexico. And you see this still being today. So the Robert E. Lee Monument gets taken down in New Orleans. The Confederate flag comes down in Dallas. The major Robert E. Lee statue. I don't even know if Robert E. Lee ever came to Texas, but nonetheless, they tear that one down. In Denton, you have a Confederate monument to the soldiers being tagged and graffitied, saying this is racist. You have all the different riots between alt-right and different counter-protest groups. So you see this is still an issue. What was started in the years after the Civil War, the kind of warping of the memory of the Civil War, and kind of the Southern idealization of it, has really created a weird situation for modern America. But I'll leave it there for you to think about, and we'll pick up with a new lecture next time.